Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. We have some people starting to filter in here, might have some more joining us, but I will go ahead and get us started. I'm Rachel Stevens, Director of the Workforce Development and Economic Policy Program in the NGA Center for Best Practices. Really pleased to welcome you all to a panel discussion today on streamlining state business regulatory processes to support economic recovery. Really appreciate you taking the time today to talk with us about this topic and ways governors and states can streamline and optimize regulatory processes as they look to support and expand businesses in their states during economic recovery and beyond. The webinar today is part of our body of work and a project we are engaged in collaboration with and support from the Pew Charitable Trusts. And this project has been really focused on supporting states in adopting and identifying innovative practices to improve business regulatory processes to support economic development. Next slide. I'll give you a quick overview of the agenda for the day before we dive in, and I'll talk a little more just about kind of NGA for those of you who might be joining us for the first time, and a little more about the project with Pew that I just mentioned, as well as a quick overview of a recent paper that we published on the topic of streamlining state business regulatory processes to support economic recovery. We're then going to get to the fun part. We're going to hear from 4 states featured in that recent publication. We're going to hear from Connecticut, Virginia, Arkansas, and Missouri about efforts underway in their states to improve business regulatory processes and how those efforts are connected with their state's overall economic recovery efforts. With our remaining time after that, we'll have time for Q&A discussion with our panelists. As a quick matter of housekeeping, you can submit questions to us using the chat function, and we'll read those questions out to our panelists during Q&A. So feel free to type things in during the panel as things are going, or when we get to that Q&A portion. We might not get to all our questions today if you have a lot of questions. So if that's the case, we'd be happy to follow up with our speakers to get written responses to any of the questions that we don't get to during our time together. And you might also notice this is being recorded. We'll post the presentation and recording slides to the NGA website following a live event, so that your colleagues that could not join are hopefully able to view the presentations. But we won't necessarily post the entire Q&A portion. So if you ask any questions, you'd kind of like to not have included in any available recording, that's absolutely fine. We want this to be an opportunity for open dialogue with our speakers and your peers during our time today. Next slide, please. All right, so my quick overview of NGA. National Governors Association is the only nonpartisan organization representing the nation's governors of our 55 states and territories. Through NGA, governors are able to identify priority issues and address public policy matters at the state, national, and global levels. My team and I are within the NGA Center for Best Practices, which is part of NGA and is the only consulting firm and research organization really dedicated specifically to supporting governors, their advisors, and state executive agency leaders. We provide a range of services from customized technical assistance to opportunities for multi-state consortia and peer learning platforms to research and publish reports to facilitating conversations within states as well as across states on emerging priority issues. We, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, are in the Workforce Development and Economic Policy Program area, and my team is really focused on supporting governors' leadership and creating really the economic environment needed for individuals, businesses, families, and communities to truly thrive and prosper. And that means looking at it from both sides in terms of supporting business growth and growth of quality jobs within states, as well as ensuring that people have access to great training and learning opportunities to make sure they're ready to take on great careers that can support themselves and their families. Next slide. We've been doing a lot over the last year and a half, as you can imagine, within our program, as well as across the organization to really support governors throughout the COVID response, reopening and recovery processes, and as we navigate kind of between all those phases. We've had an internal task force coordinating across the organization on all those policy areas you saw on that previous slide and more probably as we work with governors through this time. We've got a lot of resources online that I definitely would encourage you to take a look at if you're interested in seeing kind of what we've been up to over the last year and a half or so. We've also been making sure to help support coordination and information sharing among governors in real time for the last year and a half, helping coordinate the communication of our members' priorities with the White House and with Congress, making sure we're providing additional TA opportunities for states through a range of the types of services I just mentioned, And within our program in particular, really dedicating some specific efforts and staff resources to supporting states through stabilization and recovery. That's included various economic briefings, webinars, and other policy events for governors, senior staff. It's also included ongoing projects and new emerging projects, including work focused on entrepreneurship, rural issues, defense industry resilience, advanced manufacturing, and the work that we're here to talk about more today around streamlining business regulations. Certainly has been a hot topic during various times in the pandemic, so it was kind of well timed in a lot of ways. The NGA had the good fortune of partnering with Pew in November of 2019 to launch a new project on improving business regulations. And this project was really designed to leverage Pew's extensive body of work on this topic and to leverage our unique relationships with states. And we teamed up with the intention of providing technical assistance to support states in enhancing their capacity to identify and pursue regulatory changes that would really enable businesses in their states to grow and flourish. In November 2019, 5 states were selected to participate in a policy academy with us, through which states would engage in action planning processes to implement pilot programs, new executive orders, funding strategies, legislative changes, et cetera, to really improve the business regulatory environments in their states. Next slide, please. When this project launched in late 2019, NJ recognized the opportunity to be engaged in this work because governors really see the importance of having a regulatory environment that does not place unnecessary burden on businesses, and as a key component of really fostering a dynamic and successful state economy. When this project launched, several governors from the states initially engaged in the project really commented on the importance of this work and the relevance to their states, and you can see some examples here on the slide. As you can imagine, the pandemic changed some of our governor's specific priorities in this area, as well as our planned work in ways we were extending our support to states. But it also brought to light many challenges that existed in a lot of states' regulatory systems, and really created a new sense of urgency around helping businesses succeed through recovery and removing burdensome regulations that maybe weren't necessarily providing as many benefits as they were barriers to businesses. NGA and Pew are continuing to support states in this work and are continuing to look for ways to adapt our work to states' changing priorities in this area. So I'm really excited to be engaging in this conversation today, during which we're going to hear from several states that have been navigating all these challenges that I just kind of highlighted at a very high level, and taking action to leverage business regulatory process changes as a key strategy in their state's economic recovery. Before we introduce our panelists, I'd first like to hand it over to Madeline Ron. Madeline is a policy analyst on the Workforce Development and Economic Policy team. And Madeline will tell you a little bit more about some of the major trends that have emerged in this area and state responses during the pandemic so far. Madeline, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you all for joining. So as Rachel mentioned, our work really in this area really changed very quickly, especially given the timing of our project starting late 2019, early 2020. State priorities shifted rapidly once the pandemic started, and while we had some really exciting pilot initiatives that states were starting in this area, ultimately state capacity was changed, and also the pandemic just posed new challenges in business regulations that really required a quick pivot to address, and in some ways provided a lot of opportunities to take really rapid action to see how business regulations can be done differently, especially in a new, increasingly virtual environment. So as Rachel mentioned, we recently published a paper which featured state examples of how states have been streamlining state business regulatory processes to support economic recovery. This was both directly in response to the impacts of COVID-19 and also sort of the strategies that states are using to support their broader economic recovery goals coming out of COVID-19. So you'll see here just some of the themes that we noted. This paper features examples of state-level regulatory changes and process improvements made during the pandemic, how states are aiding longer-term economic recovery by applying lessons from the state pandemic response, and then looking forward as to how streamlining state regulatory processes for economic recovery can be a really long-term strategy for states. And we are so fortunate today to have 4 states that were featured in this paper joining us today, who will be able to go into depth just a little bit about why their state saw these business regulations as a priority and how they were able to pivot through the pandemic to really make sure that businesses have the resources that they need to meet regulatory requirements and be in compliance in this rapidly changing environment. So with that, I'm going to introduce all of our speakers, and then they will present one by one, and then we'll move into that moderated discussion. So I'm so pleased to introduce Max Geigel, who's the Program Director at the Connecticut Digital Service, Ashley Colvin, who is the Associate Director of Planning, Evaluation, and Regulation at the Virginia Department of Planning and Budget. Oh no, my screen, sorry everyone. My apologies. Mike Preston, who is the Secretary of Commerce and Executive Director at the Arkansas Economic Development Commission, and Rob Dixon, who's the Director at the Missouri Department of Economic Development. So each of them are going to share about some really exciting initiatives that they have going on in their state, talk a little bit about how it connects with their broader economic development priorities, and then we'll get to have a discussion. So I first will hand it over to Max to start his thoughts.
All right, excellent. I'm going to share my screen and some slides and quickly walk through one of the projects that is mentioned within the NGAPU report. So first of all, my name is Max Geigel, Program Manager for Connecticut's Digital Service. In short, our team helps all the agencies with any digital projects they might have, whether it's websites, forms, and applications. As such, our game is often thinking about access and how to improve access for any user for any product. The Pew report talks about 2 specific COVID-related projects the state of Connecticut kind of presented to improve the interaction for entrepreneurs in the state of Connecticut. I'm going to talk specifically about one pivot of one of the projects that's noted in there. And again, this is really about access. We'll talk more about regulation, I'm sure, as the conversation goes on. But for some context, Governor Lamont, state of Connecticut, has been very clear that he's looking to improve access for anybody in the state of Connecticut or outside the state of Connecticut looking to use the state's services. Our team has been focusing on the digital front door for anybody here, specifically talking about entrepreneurs and business owners. And so we started a project trying to think about what do entrepreneurs need? How can we improve the regulatory environment for entrepreneurs? And how can we provide better access and more streamlined and sensible access for anybody using those services? To start the project, we first asked specifically what entrepreneurs needed. And we've done a good amount of research with state entrepreneurs and business owners to see what are they looking for, what improvements do they want. And this was our express need. We built the project around specifics underneath this umbrella of need that was brought to us. And in general, entrepreneurs wanted the state to improve the environment in ways to, 1, tailor services to them, 2, present information, whether it's governmental or the services that are being provided in their language, so those businesses could grow. They would like the state to be more proactive and wanted the state to partner with them versus what had been previously, and to some degree is still a difficult process for an entrepreneur to work with the state of Connecticut. Out of all of the ways that an entrepreneur works with the state, we wanted to focus on the startup process. We felt that this was a barrier that entrepreneurs should not have to go through. And while there is up to 23 agencies that an entrepreneur might have to work with in order to start up the business, we needed to kind of streamline the startup process so we could help that business owner struggling. Now, the pandemic, of course, is its own special case. And we did additional research to understand specifically how that entrepreneur was affected by the pandemic and what specific services they might need from the government. And we included that in the project. And so the project that we did that, again, is discussed in the NGAPU report, is business.ct.gov. The idea being, if instead of the entrepreneur going to multiple agencies in order to get their business done, to open their doors in the state of Connecticut, that they can go to one place with a seamless and standardized interaction between the agencies. In short, we stood up business.ct.gov that has content from multiple agencies. We started with 5 agencies, including the Department of Economic and Community Development, Secretary of State's Office, Department of Consumer Protection, Department of Labor, and provided a chatbot as well for a more personalized experience. We also started to improve the back end. Part of this is improving services on the front end, but also for those folks at the state agencies that have to provide it. Our team is housed within the Department of Administrative Services, which is a centralized agency, but our partners and our stakeholders across all agencies needed to have an improved experience as well. So we did a little bit of improvement on the back end so folks in the state can understand who's coming through the service, and a few other improvements. In short, we provided a standardized experience. You can go to business.ct.gov and quickly go through a checklist to understand, depending on your needs as a business owner, how you start up a business in the state of Connecticut, and then links out to those agencies in order for the entrepreneur to get it done. Now, this is just the first iteration. We've iterated 5 times on it since, and we'll continue this project to improve and broaden this tool for entrepreneurs. But it was specifically useful in the pandemic, so we could provide specific services that business owners really needed when thinking about transitioning their business or finding additional resources for their struggle with the pandemic and related. This is just what the front end looks like, and it's been used. One of the lessons, and I'll get a little bit into the lessons, but we did find that folks do need it. The entrepreneurs are looking to have better access with the state of Connecticut's services. While we built the tool and after we built the tool, we noted that uptake of those services, not just of the tool itself, but the services that buttress the front end, were being used more just due to improved access. We found that entrepreneurs did use the streamlined process, and it has drastically improved their interaction with the state. Now, the regulatory process and how agencies interface with the tool is what we would address next. Our team looks at service design as well as UX and UI on websites. And so we'll be looking to, in subsequent iterations, understand how agencies also would be able to provide better services through better access in standardized tools across agencies. Now, some lessons that we would like to share with everybody is that we have found that business owners, they specifically need better access. And if a state does provide that and invest in solutions to improve and standardize that experience, that they'll use it. I'm sure other colleagues in service here will have similar stories on uptake and improved systems, but we certainly do want to put it out there that we did learn that entrepreneurs will specifically use the services if they're built. So that's our project. I'm looking forward to questions afterwards, and I appreciate the space to share the project.
Great. Thank you very much, Max. And Ashley, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, can everybody see my slides?
Yes,
yep, we can see it.
Excellent, okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ashley Colvin, and I'm Associate Director of the Virginia Department of Planning and Budget. Part of our role as the budget agency is to review proposed regulations and analyze the economic impact, and then recommend approval or disapproval to the governor. So I'm here today to talk with you about Virginia's experience with a pilot program we conducted over the past 3 years that was aimed at reducing regulatory burden. As I discussed in the upcoming slides, a key aspect of this process was streamlining regulatory requirements. Virginia may be the first state to regulate a profession. When the General Assembly passed a law in 1639 to regulate physicians and surgeons because of what they described at the time as a moderate and excessive rates and prices being exacted. This moved from the county court into the administrative realm in 1884 when the Board of Medical Examiners was created. Now, our pilot program began a few years later in 2018, following the passage of legislation that was broadly supported by Governor Northam and legislative leaders. The focus was on two pilot agencies that regulate occupations and professions: the Department of Criminal Justice Services, or DCJS, and the Department of Professional and Occupational Regulation, or DPOR. The overall objective was to lower regulatory burden, and this was done by either streamlining compliance with the requirement or actually eliminating regulatory requirements. Now, since there's an interest in how the data are collected and assessed, I'll briefly describe that part. Virginia decided to focus on something we could measure directly: the number of requirements. We did not assess anything more indirect, such as savings. As for the counting process itself, we used a two-step approach. First, we had to define what requirements are, which required a lot of upfront discussion. Second, we excluded any requirements that were mandatory. The focus, therefore, was on the discretionary requirements that agencies themselves developed, not on anything they were directed to have by legislation, a court order, or federal regulation. Once the agencies developed a baseline count of their discretionary requirements, they were directed to reduce them by 25% over a 3-year period that ended last month. This was measured by determining the number of requirements that were either eliminated or streamlined through rulemaking or other activities. Now, in addition to the two pilot agencies, the remaining executive branch agencies also had to count their requirements and determine if they were mandatory or discretionary. These catalogs, as we call them, are now available on our website for the public to review. Slide 3 provides more information about the two pilot agencies and the outcomes of their efforts. Starting with DPOR, the 18 regulatory boards supported by this agency regulate over 300,000 people across a wide variety of different occupations and professions. Because each board is vested with the authority to promulgate regulations, it was up to the boards to determine how to respond to the pilot legislation. And as shown on the slide, the boards responded in different ways, but the overall reduction across all boards collectively was 27%. This exceeded the 25% reduction target in the pilot legislation. The majority of this reduction in regulatory burden was accomplished through streamlining, not through elimination of requirements. The other agency, DCJS, regulates almost 100,000 professionals in both the private and public sectors. This board had less success in meeting the legislative objective. They had an overall reduction of 14%, which was largely comprised of streamlining requirements that applied to the private sector. The impact of COVID and other external events over the past year focused the board's attention on law enforcement matters rather than regulatory reduction. And this points to a challenge these kinds of initiatives can face, which is that changing circumstances can interfere with the ability of a citizen board to accomplish objectives. Now, slide 4 focuses on the streamlining efforts undertaken by both pilot agencies. These largely consisted of replacing legacy systems that used paper-driven processes with cloud-based systems that included mobile applications. As you can see on the slide, the modernization efforts at DCJS allowed all applications to be submitted electronically, which in 1 year reduced the processing time by 20%. This saves time and effort for both the regulated community and the agency itself. Likewise, DPOR streamlined its licensing system to also allow fully online applications. They also implemented several related initiatives, such as a new system that allows for digital licenses and credentials instead of paper-based documentation. They also implemented payment options that removed the previous requirement that regulants create an agency-managed account and keep track of passwords. Now, in some of these cases, legislation was needed to facilitate the outcome, such as new language that allowed mobile and digital credentials to be legally equivalent to those printed on paper. And legislation was also adopted that eliminated the statutory requirement for one profession to be regulated at all. This allowed the board to then eliminate the discretionary requirements they developed in response to the legislation, which required them to regulate the profession. In other cases, the decision was made to defer consideration of additional deregulation pending further study. Now, looking more broadly, the streamlining noted earlier is directly attributable to the pilot program because it focused agency attention and resources on regulatory matters. This is similar to what we've seen with earlier initiatives such as cybersecurity and program integrity. In each case, agencies responded to the initiative by making changes they had already identified but had not yet pursued. In other words, by demonstrating the importance of regulatory reform, the pilot projects gave agencies the impetus to prioritize those changes that supported regulatory reform. Not surprisingly, many of the changes involved IT and staff, and many different agencies, not just the pilot agencies, reported that the attention to regulatory reform resulted in an increase in regulatory staff, which improved the efficiency of their regulatory processes. Now, a final point is that streamlining and other changes will only work if agencies start with what we call business process reengineering. Simply put, if an agency doesn't begin by examining what they do, how they do it, and why, they will simply automate or add staff to a process that is still inefficient. And that's the extent of my presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Ashley. And next, I am going to hand it over to Mike Preston.
All right. Well, thank you, Madeline. Appreciate you and your team and Rachel and everyone there, NGA and Pew for putting this together. And I think it's important work and really enjoyed learning from my colleagues here and some of the initiatives they have. Taking a little bit of a different approach. I don't have slides to share. I just want to talk a little bit through kind of what we went through here in Arkansas and the initiative that our governor put forward as it relates to our economy and trying to recover from the pandemic. So when we were, a little over a year ago in the height of the pandemic, and we were looking to, make the adjustments necessary to continue the operations of business and how do we live in the midst of a pandemic, the governor pulled together what he called his Economic Recovery Task Force. This was chaired. It was a public-private partnership because it was made up of a lot of private sector enterprises and representatives, as well as the public sector, as myself and two other cabinet secretaries representing our Department of Agriculture and our Department of Parks, Heritage, and Tourism. But it was chaired by Stuart Walton, who is the grandson of Sam Walton, the founder of Walmart. And Stuart is a board member of Walmart and has various business interests in our state. Additionally, we had about 25 other representatives on the board, on the task force from all types of associations, business owners from all sectors, athletic directors from the University of Arkansas, school representatives. We even had a former White House chief of staff join us on the task force. So we wanted to make sure we got a flavor of all areas as we were looking to better our economy and make recommendations on how we securely and safely reopen businesses, taking a data-driven approach to making recommendations to the governor on how we move forward. And this kind of ties into what we've been talking about today on the regulatory side. Some of the things that we saw that was most impactful to businesses at the time, because we were operating under an executive order of emergency authority, we were able to lessen some restrictions that businesses had and some guidelines that we had on the regulatory side. Some things as simple as, allowing for restaurants to accommodate for outdoor seating, and how do we have to, set up the tables alongside the sidewalk to be in compliance with state law. Other things is to-go drinks. So serving alcohol and being able to allow to put a cover on it and a lid and take it with you. So what we saw from our businesses and learned from this and from those representatives on the Recovery Task Force is it worked. Businesses were able to stay open. They could, follow the CDC guidelines and socially distance and have these programs in place that previously we couldn't do because of the regulatory framework in our state. So we then, as a task force, made the recommendation to the governor, and the governor followed through in our legislative session that we made some of these changes permanent. I could go into the details. I think, we're a little short on time, so I'll spare all the details, but there's other aspects of that, including online registration, where before you'd have to go down to our Department of Finance and Administration and actually, pay your dues in person, or other areas that we went digital and were able to make adjustments for, and we made those recommendations. And as a result, our businesses are, on the path to recovery because of that. And these regulatory hurdles have now been removed. More so, I'd say, from a business perspective side, and how they're able to operate and function. But then we wanted to take it a step further, and we engaged to what we called our Arkansas Economic Recovery Strategy. And we worked with a group called Heartland Forward, that's in association with the Walton Family Foundation, to come up with recommendations on what we needed to do as a state as we look to turn the tide on post-pandemic world, and how we're going to continue to operate, and the things that we needed to focus on. And I'll just hit those high-level recommendations that we came out with. And I think this can be shared in many states that are represented here today, but also who might be just participating and listening. But talent and workforce, how we can have a better streamlined approach to that, focus on the talent side, our data sciences services that we have in Arkansas, and bolstering that into a more streamlined approach. Our innovation and research, how do we put more funding behind our research alliance, so that we are drawing down more research dollars from a federal perspective, and getting those more into our state. On entrepreneurship and small business, how do we have a better support for our entrepreneurial support organizations, and a funding source for them? It's been kind of disjointed, and have more of a one-stop shop, if you will, as a lot of people coming out of this pandemic are looking for new business opportunities. A lot of them are going to be startups, and they need support from the state. How can they have access to all those resources through either their local ESO, or in that combination with the state? So it's a recommendation coming out there. Healthcare, obviously, I don't need to go into details about that, and how we continue to make that an emphasis for all of our states and our communities. More specific to Arkansas is the supply chain and logistics, with logistics companies like J.B. Hunt, obviously Walmart and Tyson. Logistics play a big part in that, and what we put into our colleges and the universities in terms of a center of excellence related to supply chain and logistics. And then continuing to build out high-speed internet in areas of our state that are very rural, or in some cases underserved, for access to broadband or high-speed internet. As we all learned coming out of the pandemic, we knew we had challenges, but the pandemic really highlighted that when you go to remote work, remote education, telehealth and medicine, that if you don't have access to high-speed internet, you're not going to be able to have the ability to do any of those things. So putting additional funds, whether it be through our CARES or through the new round of ARP funding that is out there, this continues to be a priority for the state. So I wanted to just mention that this is kind of the approach that we've taken as our state. Obviously, the regulatory process in this is a big part of it, and we were proud of the recommendations that we were able to make to our legislature, and now have been enacted, and it's certainly been a help and a support to our businesses. So again, thank you for the time, and look forward to the questions. And Madeline, I'll hand it back over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mike. And last but not least, we have Rob.
Thank you. Can you see my screen, my slides there?
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Hi, I'm Rob Dixon. I'm the director of the Missouri Department of Economic Development. I serve in Governor Parsons' cabinet and lead our state agency with primary responsibility for economic and community development, workforce training for businesses, as well as our tourism development and marketing efforts. Rather than talk about some of the specific regulatory relief that we enacted over the course of the pandemic and our recovery efforts, I wanted to talk a little bit today about sort of the process that we followed to get there, because we have a similar story to many of our colleagues around the country, and we've followed the news from NGA, and the Pew Charitable Trust folks have been really great to share that information and best practices for us. And we've, kind of had a similar approach to many of our colleagues around the country in terms of trying to address some of the most immediate issues that businesses are facing as a result of the pandemic. But again, wanted to just touch on briefly how our response and recovery work fit into our broader economic development efforts. And so even before the pandemic, back to 2018, Governor Parson came into office and really asked us to take a hard look at our entire approach to economic development. I'll spare you a lot of the details, but the gist of it was that we felt like we were falling behind many of our competitor states around the country. And we started a process that we, called Best in the Midwest, because that's our aspiration with respect to our friends to the South. We do feel like Missouri has a lot to offer in economic development, but for a variety of reasons, we were falling behind our competitors. So we put in place some pretty serious data and performance metrics, really looked at how we were performing, used that to shape our strategy. And long story short, is we went from being one of the largest economic development agencies in the Midwest with nearly over 1,000 employees to one of the smallest now. We're shy of 100, but a much more focused effort and a much more, as we call it, laser-focused approach for our organization, really focused around workforce development, infrastructure development, and removing barriers to business. And that's the governor's priority. So that's the background and the underpinning that we went into the pandemic with, very lean and mean, very nimble, and very focused on addressing the most salient issues that were being faced by our business community. So when the pandemic hit, we brought literally all of state government together. And I know many states, different agencies work together, but rather than working on the same issues together, we were literally in the same effort, sharing the same process. And so we actually engaged with the McChrystal group. And for those of you who are familiar with General Stanley McChrystal and the Team of Teams process, we utilized that across the entire 16 cabinet agencies and brought in some of our external non-state government partners. And literally every single day during the pandemic, we were bringing leaders together from every level of the agency, whether it was cabinet director level down to frontline employees. We were looking at the same data, we were addressing the same issues, and we were talking about the solutions together to whatever those problems of that moment were. And as a result, it really brought together a holistic view of what the issues were, so that you didn't have just, for example, one regulatory agency thinking about an issue on their own, or a social service agency or an economic or commerce agency, but literally we were all bringing different perspectives together. And I think the results of that have been really beneficial to us. We've seen tremendous resurgence in jobs, folks coming back in the workforce. We're extremely proud of that. We know that there's still some ways to go, but our economic development project pipeline is stronger and better than it has been. I know many states are in a similar situation because of the strong economy, but we believe relative to where we were before the pandemic, because of the strategic shift and because of the way that we brought kind of all of government together to address these issues, that we're in much better shape than we would have been otherwise from an economic development strategy. And all of it is because we're focused on those specific issues. So the next slide, just to very briefly touch on kind of the general ways that we approach the recovery. Again, very similar to our colleagues on the panel today and others around the country, but really targeted our economic recovery efforts around citizens, communities, and businesses, and we kind of organized ourselves accordingly. And so from the regulatory perspective, and I know several of the items that we worked on in Missouri were featured in the white paper by NGA and Pew, and we really appreciate and are honored by being recognized in that way. But we stuck to basics. We stuck to those pre-pandemic economic development priorities of, focusing on workforce development, focusing on infrastructure development, and making our state's business climate one in which businesses want to locate and operate. And so, like many of the colleagues on the call today, we looked at food and beverage type regulations. We looked at licensure type regulations. But those are some of the things that we've seen start to transition from a temporary situation in a state of emergency to now starting to look at more permanent regulatory reform. And a couple of very specific things that we're really proud of. Earlier this year, Governor Parson signed a variety of professional licensure requirement changes into law, which really allow for increased reciprocity across state lines, which help us obviously attract and retain talented professionals. And some of them even focused on military spouses so that we can help attract and retain some of those folks. Missouri has two really large military installations and we're really trying to work to make our state a veteran-friendly community. And so that helps us do that. But certainly it addresses one of the top economic development issues in workforce development and talent attraction. So we put in place, like I said, a wide variety of regulatory and statutory waivers over the course of the pandemic, and are looking at those that we can enact on a permanent basis. And that's really a lot of the work that is underway across different agencies right now. I won't get into the financial assistance because I think very similar to our colleagues, we all kind of utilize those CARES Act and a variety of other federal resources to help, get our economy jump started. And we are very appreciative of those resources. But on the technical assistance front, this is the last piece I wanted to mention before we get into Q&A. But a big part of our strategy is to help bridge connections and make those connections and bridge resources together. So one of the things that was highlighted in the report is a business recovery lab that our team put together to really help bring sector-specific or industry-specific resources to businesses, whether it was a grant program or a potential vendor relationship. And really, a lot of it was focused for us on the PPE relationship. We worked with Google, actually, and we're, sometime last summer, the vice president talked about this from the podium of the White House, which was a pretty big honor for our team. But the PPE Google Marketplace that we put in place was really designed to try to connect Missouri suppliers and Missouri manufacturers with those potential customers of PPE, and trying to, just very, very rapidly put those folks in touch with each other. Now, that has since moved on from government, has kind of been taken over into the private sector, rightly so. But it was really bringing those folks together and trying to help buttress our state's manufacturers in a time that we really needed them to increase their PPE production. As a result, today we actually have more suppliers, more producers of PPE than we did before. And obviously, there's a lot more market demand than there was. But a lot of the work that we did was to really help get those folks online through some of these kind of non-financial and non-regulatory resources as well. But again, for us, it was sticking to basics, following the kind of the playbook that we put in place prior to the pandemic. And it's really kind of stayed true to our values in Missouri, which is, frankly, small government, and keep the minimal amount of regulations in place that are necessary for the good order. But allow businesses the ultimate flexibility to do their thing so that we can have job creation and growth. And it's really paying off for us right now. But really appreciate the opportunity to connect today with my fellow panelists and the folks on the call, and look forward to the Q&A. So Madeline, thanks so much, and back to you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and thank you all for your presentations. I'm looking forward to this discussion. We have about 20 minutes to wrap up with some Q&A, so those of you in the audience, feel free to send some through the chat. I am going to kick off with a question. What are some of the key stakeholders that states should consider engaging in these efforts? I know many of you mentioned some of them, but are there any particularly relevant stakeholders, including getting business feedback or engaging with particular agencies in your states that have really helped you be successful in these efforts?
I'd certainly be happy to jump in, Madeline. And as I mentioned, we engaged a lot of associations in addition to businesses. We wanted to make sure that we were kind of hitting all sectors. So not only, agriculture, manufacturing, headquarters, but then on the association side. So we were represented, by our faith communities, our, automobile associations, bringing in as many of those so that they could kind of, represent the entire, employer and workforce that we have in our state. To really get the feedback that we were looking for, because we don't want to forget about anyone. That partnered with obviously the privates, the public sector, and our cabinet officials. To me, made it really important to bring those stakeholders in, and then obviously our local chambers of commerce and our local economic development organizations who have boots on the ground and are hearing it day to day. Bringing them in was certainly important, and I would just make sure you consider all those stakeholders in your states and your communities as you are working on these issues.
And I would add to that, if I could, completely agree with everything that Mike just said. It's very similar to our experience in Missouri. But we saw a key role for our department as an economic development agency, or a kind of a commerce agency, but that which is not a regulatory body, to try to be a bit of a connector between the public and private sector because what we found, outside of those traditional regulatory relationships that exist, there just was not a lot of familiarity with some of the key, associations and outside organizations that we might rely on. So we spent a lot of time trying to be that bridge between public and private, even though we are a public sector agency ourselves, but we work very, very closely with the private sector. And I think, having that relationship, those relationships in place really allowed us to get very quickly to those pain points and help our sister agencies kind of understand it from the outside perspective, but very similar to Mike's experience as well.
I'd actually like to add to Mike's as well. We also worked with a number of outside organizations, like Mike had said. But we found a great value in talking to business owners that had multiple touch points with a number of agencies, those that had complex relationships with the states. So agencies themselves could draw insights from other agencies. Many states have, to some degree, silos between agencies, and we found a lot of use in understanding the user experience between those agencies so the state could learn from their experience as well.
Yeah, the only thing I might add to that is that our most valuable partner probably was the legislature, because so many of the processes are based upon assumptions or statutes that people haven't really looked at in a long time. And getting members of the legislature comfortable with changing some of the statutes that govern agency behavior allowed them to do things in new ways that they hadn't been able to do before, and that let them bring some efficiencies into place. Things like being able to have mobile digital certificates instead of paper ones. Seemingly small, a fairly easy legislative fix, a sentence or two, but made a world of difference because it allowed something to be done that hadn't even been possible before.
Thanks. And I just had a question coming through the chat. A few of you talked about how you've been collecting data, both to identify kind of some of the choke points in regulatory systems and in compliance, and also in measuring success of these initiatives. How do you collect that data, and how do you define success, and what metrics are you looking at to measure success and the progress made by the initiatives you've implemented?
That's a fantastic question. I don't think we have the time or space to go through all the KPIs that we have for our programs, but I would say the data that we collect, we try for it to be representative. We're looking to give good access to all. And so the data we have to have is broad. It's very easy within data collection in order to have specifically focus on a segment that's accessible for those that are collecting data. And we had to be mindful that we had to go beyond what was easy so we can have a representative sample for the services we're looking to improve.
I guess I would just add that Virginia decided, as I mentioned earlier, just to focus on counting the requirements themselves, because since this was supposed to be a pilot project that might be expanded to other agencies, we needed something that could scale. We needed something that all agencies could be assessed under that rubric. And when we start looking at things more indirect, such as savings, if I were to try to assess savings attributable to reducing a requirement, then I might have to start looking at the average hourly wage of the regulated community to see how it affects different professions. It was a lot more direct to simply say, these requirements were streamlined, you can now do this online, it saves time, or these requirements were eliminated. That allowed us to create something that everybody across both aisles and both branches of government could buy into.
Looks like we have a question from the audience. I'm going to unmute Alex Jones and see. Alex, do you have a question? Oh. Maybe it was an accidental hand raise. Sorry about that. I have another question that I would like to pose. So during the pandemic, we saw small businesses especially be impacted by just changes in the economy due to requirements for social distancing and just less economic activity overall. How can regulatory process improvements be intentionally inclusive of small businesses, especially minority-owned and women-owned businesses?
I can start on that one. One thing in particular that's shaping our response is our governor himself. He is a former small business owner. He has a cattle operation and also operated kind of a small community sheriff, as well as a small business owner in a rural part of our state in his background. And that really shaped, I think, a lot of his perspective on how government in general, during a pandemic or otherwise, has an impact on a small business owner. And so that is something that the governor, across every agency, that kind of experience, he's reinforcing with us all the time in cabinet meetings and in other discussions. But always asking us and making us think about how that affects that Main Street small business owner. We are doing it in a formal way, actually backing that up. The governor, just by executive order, created what we call the Show Me Strong Recovery Task Force, and it's specifically designed to explore additional ways that the state of Missouri can enact, business-friendly policies that are helping small businesses, and really also with a special emphasis on minority-owned businesses. And so this is stemming from the governor's personal experience, and then he's created formal structures that he's asked myself and other cabinet leaders to co-lead with private sector folks to bring forward specific recommendations at the end of this year. And so for us, it's sort of a part of, whether it's pandemic recovery or not, it's literally a part of, what we do every day to try to continue to drive our state forward.
And I'll just add, much like what Rob said, I agree. We do similar things here in Arkansas, as I'm sure many other states do as well. But when we were utilizing some of our CARES funds during the pandemic, we wanted to as we were helping businesses who were trying to reopen or restock or market their business, that they're continue to be open. We set aside a significant portion of that for women and minority-owned businesses in the small business category to make sure that we were, they weren't missing anything. We did, webinars and Zoom calls just like this to get the word out. So when we open those programs up, they'd have a front seat line to them and making sure those funds were getting out there. In addition, this is more maybe on the business support side. We increased access and opportunities for procurement with state and local contracts for women-owned and small and minority-owned businesses to kind of be first in line again for contracting opportunities with the state. As a lot of these federal funding dollars were coming in, and we knew we'd have to do partnerships with small businesses. We wanted to make sure again that they were first in line. So more of a kind of a business support side there, not necessarily on the regulatory side. I don't know if any of the other panelists want to address it on the regulatory side, but that's more of a business support for those entities.
Yeah, that's helpful. And we actually just had a question come in the chat too about that sort of, it sounds like business support side, how to make sure that harder to reach communities have access to all the opportunities available. I don't know if Ashley and Max, you want to jump in or move on to the next question.
I can address this really briefly from the regulatory side, since that was our focus. One of the things that might be unique about Virginia, I'm not sure, is that in our case, agencies do not develop the economic impact assessment for regulations. We do. We, as the budget agency, assess what the economic impact is going to be. And one of the things our statute charges us with looking at is the impact on small businesses. There's very specific criteria we have to look through. And more broadly, the statutes that govern professions and occupations have 4 specific criteria that are supposed to guide whether or not a profession or occupation should be regulated in the first place. And that's the kind of thing that our legislative auditors look at once in a while. So those kinds of things were baked into the process. We didn't feel there was anything we had to add to that because those mechanisms were already in place and we felt were working pretty well.
On our end, for user experience, most of our tools that we've built have analytics built into it, and we've been using that data not just to understand who is using these services, but who isn't using those services. with the idea that there are folks broader than those that have access to the internet that need the services themselves. And so when we build a website, we also think about the omni-channel services, whether it's mail or in-person visits that may or may not have been available during the pandemic, that are still very useful, even as we go into a more digital future.
And we have just a couple more minutes. I want to pose just one last question to you all as kind of a wrap up. What are some of the lessons learned through the pandemic that may impact your state's approach to business regulatory process improvements moving forward? And how do you see that fitting into your state's broader economic development goals? Many of you have touched on this already, but just as kind of some closing thoughts on that.
Just from my perspective, we've learned collectively, we have learned that we can do without some of these regulations, and that while maybe well-intentioned or well-meaning when they were enacted initially, they may not be necessary in a modern economy. And I think it's forced us to take a look at those regulations that are in place and make sure that they still make sense, and kind of challenging some of that conventional thinking. So that's the biggest lesson for us, I think, is that we can always look for better ways to remove barriers to business growth and, frankly, make it easier to operate.
And I'd just add that, I think it gives us an opportunity to go back and look at statutes that we have on the book and say, how is this going to, is this still relevant? Why do we need this? And how is this going to impact us if we go back into an area or a time where it's, pandemic driven and we need to think about it? So it's given us an opportunity to really work with, again, those stakeholders we talked about before, but I know Ashley brought up the relationship with the legislature, an opportunity for the legislature to go in and look at those regulations and how they've impacted businesses. And, some of them probably haven't been updated since, the 1960s or 70s, and the world's changed a lot since then. And it also kind of puts it in the forefront too of our legislatures passing new laws. How will this impact in the future, and make sure they don't tie the hands so much that we have to go back and correct it. So it kind of allows us to think a little bit more progressively and forward thinking in terms of how does it impact businesses, but also our state's economic development.
And I would just add one really quick thing. Perhaps it's because I got my start as legislative staff. But one thing I've noticed on the executive side is that agencies often don't realize they can change statute, that they can request it, that it be changed. And a lot of them have been on the books for a really long time and have processes in there that nobody really even knows what they mean anymore. So don't wait for a pandemic to start looking at that stuff. Go ahead and make those changes ahead of time.
The only quick note I'd add is that while we digitize services, there's data to be used that you can improve the regulatory process and draw insights from for either the legislature or agencies in order to improve what they're providing to citizens.
Well, on that note, we have just 2 minutes left, so I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you so much again to all of our panelists. This was a really great discussion, and it's so great to hear the great work going on in all of your states. And I'm excited to follow how this work continues through economic recovery and into the future. And thank you to all of you who have joined us today. Please stay tuned for further opportunities to engage in this body of work, and let us know what you would like to hear about. We are really looking for how we can support states in thinking about how they can improve their business regulatory processes and what their priorities are in that area right now. So please reach out if you have any thoughts or questions. And again, thank you so much for joining. Have a great day.